Hello everyone. Welcome to the part 2 of my Nimzo-Larsen Attack series. Today we're going to be talking about d5 systems. So without wasting any time, let's get into it. So last time, as you remember, we talked about b3, e5, and then bishop b2, and here we talked about many different lines. Today we're going to be talking about d5, bishop b2, and even right here in this position, there's already multiple ways that black can reply. There's a c5, which I think is one of the most critical lines. There's bishop to g4, and there's also knight to f6. These are all the main ideas. Let's start with c5. Against c5, we start with pawn to e3. Now, notice a very key detail. We don't start with knight to f3 in this variation for a very specific reason. If we start with knight to f3, what black can do is black can actually play this move f6. The idea, of course, being to play e5, and we don't have d4 here because after d4 captures, black still gets the big center. So this is not something we want to go for. We want to start with pawn to e3 because pawn to e3 stops f6, because after knight c3 e5 we have d4, and here it gets quite complicated. There's even a very sharp line here. For example, if black plays e4 in this position, black already loses the queen h5 and then queen takes d5, which is of course winning the pawn and winning the position as well. So that is not something black wants to do. So correct move order is to play e3 against c5. So here, again, there's multiple ways to play after e3. Black can either play knight c6 and allow bishop b5, very similar to the last video where we talked about this bishop b5 pinning the knight. Or what black can do is black can actually play a6 and then develop the knight to c6. Okay, first let's talk about the more normal line here with just knight to c6. Against a knight to c6, we pin the knight, and after, okay, bishop d7 is not forced here, but let's assume bishop d7, knight to f3, castles, so just standard development here. We play pawn to d3. The idea of pawn to d3 is that once we capture the knight on c6, and let's assume the bishop recaptures, we can put the knight on e5, play f4, and this b1 knight will not go to c3. It will actually go to d2 and then f3, supporting his friend on e5. So that's what will happen in this position. And as you can see here, we capture, play knight to e5, pawn to f4, and later on knight d2, knight to f3. You can even play rook f3 in some lines and go either rook g3 or rook h3 to start a kingside attack. That is very situational though, and you have to figure that out in your own games, whether that's good or not. Okay, so let's go back here. Of course, if a move like a6 is played after bishop b5, we capture the knight, we don't retreat. We capture the knight on c6, and we continue with f4, and then knight to f3. Later on, we will land the knight on e5. Black will try to stop that, potentially with bishop to g4, but we can develop our queen here, castle the king, and after a couple of moves, as you can see, a couple of developing moves, here we can play e4, and it will lead to a very strong position. So one positional idea that exists here is that after, let's make a move for black, which is not a great move. Let's just say h6, for example. We play pawn to e4, and of course, black here cannot play pawn to d4 because there's a fork, but let's assume this bishop is on e7 momentarily, and this is not actually a fork. This knight landing on c4 is a very strong positional idea, and it will be very dominant on c4 because it's an outpost against the dark square bishop. So this bishop that would be on e7 would never be able to oppose the knight on c4. Okay, let's go back. So instead of knight to c6, what black can do is black can actually play a6, stopping bishop to b5. In this case, we can do a couple of things. My preferred way of playing is to go knight to f3 and then to go for g3. So we go for a double fianchetto position here. After knight to f6, bishop to g2, bishop f5, not bishop g4 necessarily, because there is h3, and this would be kind of annoying for black. So in these systems, black usually puts the bishop on f5 and does not actually pin the knight. And after castles, e6, knight or d3, bishop d6, knight to d2. Here we have a very equal position. Maybe after knight h4 here, white can even claim some advantage because we are going after this bishop. And actually here bishop g4 does not even work because bishop takes f6 is very strong for white. So black would have to give up the light square bishop. Okay, so let's go back and let's discuss other variations. Now, I'm just now realizing that I left the computer open. Okay, it's fine, but I would like to have it closed while I'm doing the analysis. So here, as I said, there's two other ways to play. Against knight to f6, we actually play pawn to e3 again, and let's assume pawn to g6 is played, although in this position, black can actually continue in multiple different ways. Black can play e6, black can play bishop to f5, but for white's development, it's going to remain relatively the same. After g6, white's going to go knight to f3, bishop g7, pawn to c4, and then pawn to d4. This structure kind of resembles a lot of d4 positions, especially the Collet systems. So this is how white can continue here. This bishop will go to e2, not d3, because d3 would be looking at a fianchetto structure here. Although, yeah, you can play d3 and put the queen on e2. Another possibility is that. The knight will go to d2, not c3, to support c4, and white will castle kingside. Okay, let's go back to this line. Okay, here there's, as I mentioned, another move, which is bishop to g4. The idea of bishop to g4 is that, first of all, it's pinning the pawn on e2. So a lot of times in Bullet, I've had an instance when my opponents played e3 and I've won the queen with the black pieces. So this is kind of funny. But the actual idea of bishop to g4 is that it is anticipating knight to f3, and as black you want to capture and double the pawns of white. And in this position, this is the kind of setup that we want to get. We want to put the bishop on g2, so again we're going for a double fianchetto structure here, and we want to put this f3 pawn on f4 to open up the bishop, and we want to put the d pawn on d4. You could play d3 as well and keep the bishop open. That depends on you, and of course you would have to analyze some of those lines on your own. But the main developing plan for this knight is not to go to c3. You want this knight to go to d2, f3, and e5. So as you can see, this idea of b1 knight going to d2, f3, and potentially e5 is a common theme in a lot of positions. And knight d2, and that's how the play will continue. However, if you don't like this variation, this is also not my preferred way of playing against a bishop to g4, because it kind of kills the game in a way that it's kind of hard for white to try to push for a win. Instead, what I like to do is to go for a double fianchetto immediately. with pawn to g3, and let's say pawn to c6, bishop g2, knight to f3, we will get a very normal position here. It's actually going to resemble King's Indian, as you can see, with this kind of a structure. And the pawn breaks here are c4 and e4. So yeah, c4 played here, queen to c2, pawn e5, e3, a5. And in this position, that's the kind of position we're going to get. One of the major ideas here is to go after this bishop with moves like g4 and knight h4 and get the bishop pair. It might look a little bit scary to push the pawns in front of your king, but some of these lines are pretty known to be okay. So I hope you enjoyed the part 2 of this video. The other parts will be coming out very soon, and I will see you in the next video. Have a great day.